All right, so the outline for today's presentation is going to be, we're going to talk a little bit about natural history of different bee species, their nesting sites. We'll talk about the particular floral resources that we have, and then a little bit on like selecting sites for habitat. So, we will talk about it a little bit throughout the presentation. We'll talk about like some potential layouts for your plants on your property that hopefully can help enhance your pollinator visitation. And then we have a section on resources where there are links to websites, potential books, and things like that that could be helpful to you and to help you on your learning journey. Okay, so if you follow me throughout the presentation, there's a ribbon at the top, and the ribbon at the top kind of tells you where we are in the presentation. So, like I said, we're going to start with natural history. And this is just like a breakdown on the main players for bees that we have in our environment here in Western Pennsylvania. Everybody knows honeybees. Honeybees are well-established species throughout the Americas, but they are non-native. They're from Europe. They are our big social species, and they have perennial colonies, which means that the colony is going to be working on continuously throughout the year. The queen can actually live between 4 to 6 years, so the queen doesn't die. She keeps producing new eggs. Sometimes these hives break apart and they break out into different groups, and there could be like a new hive being produced while the old queen moves away. They produce honey that we consume. They are domesticated, kind of like our cows and chickens, and they are a species that isn't really in decline. I did hear some reports about some new mite species or other insects that are getting into hives, but I haven't really read up on it. Okay, our other group of bees are solitary bees. 90% of the bees that we have in Western PA are solitary. We have ground nesters and stem nesters. They don't have big hives. They live by themselves. Just a female, making tunnels, laying an egg, and provisioning some pollen. There is definitely limited parental care. There are some ones that are kind of social, but not a ton. And you can think about if you were to think about like plants, how one being perennial, these could be like our annual species. They only live for 2 to 6 weeks. But they only have one brood for the season, and the whole development process takes about 12 months to happen. Now, our social species that we have here are primarily going to be the bumblebees. Here in Western Pennsylvania, we probably have somewhere between 20 to 25 different species of bumblebees. And that's going to make up our 10%. There's, carpenter bees, ones that kind of like are nuisance, and they bore holes in our decks and our porches, are semi-social. And there are some other semi-social set bees, but the predominant ones that have like a big social cast with with the queen and the workers and the drones and things like that be our bumblebees. Okay. So number of bee species throughout the country and Pennsylvania, we have 3,500 different bee species in the USA. When we get down to Pennsylvania, we have 437. In the county level, depending on how it's built, if it's like more urban or more wooded, and we can range around somewhere between like 130 to 140 species. And then in your garden, again, depending on what the makeup is of your garden, you can see about 20 to 30 different species in a given season. As you move into different environments, different bees will be present there too. This is an image I like to show. It kind of shows you the breakdown of all these bees. So, we have 118 bee species that are the Apidae, and that's going to be our bumblebees, our cuckoo bees, our squash bees, and even our honeybees are part of the Apidae, but they're not going to be included in this 437. We have our Halictidae, that's going to be our sweat bees or the metallic green bees. Andreinidae are with 100. That's going to be our mining bees, and the bees are underground. We have the Megachilidae, which they're bees that have big mandibles. They're usually leaf cutters, leaf cutter bees. And then we have these small groups like the Melodidae and like the cellophane bees. They're kind of like on the small side, or a very small group. Um, Similar to butterflies and moths, bees have a 4-stage life cycle. They start off as an egg, then they become a larva, a pupa, and then become an adult. Okay, so for a mining bee life cycle, the female's gonna dig a hole. She's gonna be collecting pollen. Um, in the bottom here in the image, there's a larva or an egg that's laid on top. It grows. It has all the food that it needs for the entire life cycle, and then it turns into a pupa, and it kind of resembles a bee, but it's not fully doesn't have its wings yet. And then it in the spring it emerges as an adult. Okay, it's gonna take and the lifespan as an adult is a really, really short span. Okay. Um, Here, just to see how it actually happens sequentially across the year, they're going to be in their pupal stage, you know, at the beginning of the year, and then towards March and then April right now, you will actually start seeing these bees emerging. And if you've gone out, you're going to be seeing a lot of the bees on whatever early flowering plant species you have on your property or you see in the woods, in gardens, etc. Most of the bees are going to be seen out there are solitary. And of course, there's honeybees out there too. So just to expand that life cycle, it's going to take about a year for it to complete the whole life cycle. Okay, so I'm going to start off with our social species. We're going to be talking about bumblebees. All right, so pictured here, this is a common eastern bumblebee. And if you've been walking around, maybe visiting Beechwood Farms or local parks, or maybe even observing your own garden, you may have seen a very, very large bumblebee looking species, probably the size of a carpenter bee. The difference is that bumblebees do not hover. But if you see a really, really big bumblebee, that is a queen, and it's most likely the queen of the common eastern bumblebee that is out, and she is, foraging and also nest searching. She's trying to build a nest so she can get started for the summer. Okay, so when we're thinking about what habitat or nesting sites bumblebees like, these are going to be, the 3 types of locations that you will find them nesting in. For starters, we can find them maybe in the leaf litter. Okay, if there's enough leaf litter kind of built up and it's kind of sheltered and water and a bit watertight, preventing anything from rain, bumblebees can start nesting on their leaf litter. Um, Most of the time, they actually like holes. They like to actually use abandoned animal burrows. Could be from a chipmunk. Could be, maybe there's a hole that in a tree that made by a woodpecker. That's bigger. Maybe those big pileated woodpecker holes. If it's big enough to house a bumblebee, maybe she's nest there. If it's lower to the ground, even better. So they like to nest. It could be from other rodents as well. And then on the thirdly, it could even be in like in really, really tall grass, especially grass that's kind of like bent over itself. One of the it's not the common eastern bumblebee, but I found a species of Bombus griseocolus, like a brown belted bumblebee. It was just nesting right under tall grass that had folded against its lower, and then as I opened it, I saw that the wax that they create to build their nest was made a full sheath over it to prevent any damage from rain. Now these nests are built out of lipids, so they expel any rain or anything like droplets that will go on it. So it keeps it pretty dry as well. Okay, so I described what bumblebees are doing there now. So I was at Todd Nature Reserve a few years ago, and I actually got to see a bumblebee queen doing the nest searching there. So I actually took a video I wanted to share with you guys, so you actually get to see what I was talking about. So this is like around this time of the year. You can see the May apples are in bloom. So this is typical behavior for a queen. She's just flying low to her ground, maybe try to find a nice suitable place to start her hive. If you also notice that the back of her legs don't have any pollen, that's also a sign that she has not established a nest. When she does have a nest established, she will start collecting pollen to bring back to her hive. Okay, nice. a short video. So breaking down the life cycle for a bumblebee. So right now the bumblebees are coming out in the spring. Those are the queens. Okay, so we're gonna start on the top left here. So a lot of these like spring ephemeral plants are going to be super important. Those are going to be the first, food sources for them. Like, even dandelion is going to be really important for them. So, in this diagram we have what looks like to be like Dutchman's breeches, or I mean, then we have a lot of like the, those rose or rosaceae, maybe the cherries that are in bloom. Those could be like the first, even non-native bulbs, like our tulips and our daffodils. Bumblebees will visit those because that's one of the few plant species that are going to be common and coming out. And what's really, really neat about bumblebees is that they can produce their own body heat. They'll sit and vibrate their wing muscles, and they can raise their body temperature to be able to fly, even when it's just about 30 degrees. A couple of days ago, actually, we enjoyed weather in the 70s and the 80s, but it went down to 40. I didn't see, the only bees I saw foraging outside were bumblebees. Okay, so that's gonna be their behaviors in the spring. They'll be doing a lot of foraging. Then maybe by the end of by the middle of next month or the end of next month, we'll start seeing fewer and fewer of bumblebees out. And it's because they usually establish nests. Now, you might see fewer common eastern bumblebees, but because there's very variety of different species here in Pennsylvania, we might start seeing queens of other species that are just emerging, and then that live probably further into the fall or anything like that. But if we had to take a little snapshot what their nest looks like inside, is gonna be the eggs are gonna be laid in clumps, and there's gonna be workers, and then throughout the summer the queen stops leaving once she has her first set of workers. She doesn't need to go out. She's gonna be producing and building her colony. Then towards the fall, she stops producing a pheromone, um, and she starts producing males. So she starts, instead of producing fertilized eggs, she starts producing unfertilized eggs, which are going to turn into drones, and those are males. And then she will also produce new queens. The new queens, or they call them gynes, they will leave the nest, mate with males of the same species that are out there from different colonies, and then they will overwinter down in the leaf litter, and they go into a diapause, or their form of hibernation, and then they will, start the whole process. They will go dormant until late March and April of the following year. So all the queens that you see right now, they were actually born last year. Okay, yeah, and this is what it actually looks like. So this is a bumblebee colony. Looks very, very different than what you would think maybe a honeybee colony looks like. Honeybee colonies, they have those beautiful hexagons. Bumblebees, they have these pots that they mold with, mixing their saliva with pollen and nectar, and they do a little bit of pottery, and they, build them up. I love some of these photos. These are from my research bees. But on the top, the square on the top right, you see how pots got really tall, which is unusual. They just got a little enthusiastic, I think. But if those pots are open, they usually are, storing nectar, which eventually is kind of like their honey. In the middle, in the bit larger photo, with the middle, you see the queen. She's very large compared to her daughters and the workers. And yes, there's a little sneaky honeybee that got into the hive, and lucky to be alive, because bumblebees usually kill everything that goes into the hive that is not a bumblebee. So yeah, so this is what a bumblebee nest looks like. All these egg-shaped structures are larvae that are developing, and the ones that are open contain nectar. Okay, so we have bumblebees then. So now let's move on to solitary bees. So that's going to be the next group. This is our, the predominantly of our native bees. The types of habitat actually kind of look like this. They could be, areas between rocks and stones, anything like that. And you can actually, in the circle here, you can actually see a little solitary bee poking its head out of the burrow. Okay, or it could be, a patchy lawn or grass, and they also like to nest there. So different species are going to have different, preferences of where they're nesting. They actually prefer soil that is, has really good drainage, like loam or sandy soil. The reason for this is because is easier to dig through. Now, if you have something like this really compacted like clay, clay is not going to work for ground nesting bees. And if you have a lot of clay on your property, then you're not going to see too many of them unless they're like traveling afar from maybe a neighbor's lawn or somewhere. They have a short flight distance, but predominantly ground nesting bees do not like hard hard soils or anything like that. And yes, they can actually change the soil composition because they're actually digging pretty deep and they're bringing out soils that are deep down in the ground onto the surface. So they can alter that a little bit. Now, here's on turf. Here's what it will typically look like. Just an aggregation of all these ground nesting bees. And when you see all these little piles of soil out that they've been moving, that's called tumulus. All right, so it's the soil that's piled up outside of these burrows. Okay. And yeah, so this is an interesting image, but it gives you kind of like an idea of what the diversity is in ground nesting bee, dens or how they lay their eggs. You have ones on A where the female she digs one tunnel, provisions some pollen, she's collecting pollen. She lays an egg, closes it up, and leaves. That's the parental care. Sometimes they like on B they put multiples in one, and they're going to be at different life stages. So that, you can see there are different sizes. At C, you can see that there's just some loops being built, some entrances and exits, access to multiple tunnels that she has made. And usually she does this. She can put a variety of them at different life stations in a single area. But once she's provided the pollen and laid the egg, she seals it up and doesn't revisit it again. So that is it. And then D is just more variation in this. And here's a really cool image too, just because there is quite a bit of diversity. It isn't just those, and because they make these tunnels, they actually are changing. Like I said, they change the soil composition, but it changes how plants are acquiring water. Through their root systems. It may change like the microbiota or the fungal communities underground too. And usually they have their benefits. I don't think they're causing anything detrimental. But this is just more of the diversity, how they are related in proximity to different plant species, to trees, because they like to nest near their food sources too. Okay. Okay. So if we're thinking about it a little bit on think about it in landscaping terms. So here is a nice house with they put in a lot of work and putting in natives on their walkway. They have these stepping stones, they have ferns, they have these plants here, and everywhere. So when you are like setting up your garden to make it really, really attractive to pollinators, you can, excuse me, you can plant your plants pretty densely. Try to simulate what you probably would see in the woods or in the field. Everything is kind of like intertwined. The plants are growing just fine. Keeping it as natural and what the bees would be accustomed to when they're out in the woods or anything like that is the best way to do it. Usually, reduce the use of mulch. The mulch actually can act as a barrier to nesting in there. So, mulch is gonna have like the wood and everything like that, and that's gonna create like a wall that the bees are just gonna have trouble accessing. You can actually, what would be better as your substitute for the traditional kind of mulch would be to use any leaf litter or the plant material from your plants that have already been established in your garden. Grind that up a little bit and include that in your as your mulch. And also, aside from like mulch like you get at the store, they also are causing a bit of. There have been reports of them causing the spread of those invasive earthworms that are kind of like usually on the surface. I think they're called, I don't know if they're called jumping birds. I forget their name, but yeah. So I would suggest just using leaf litter and other plant materials that you already have at home in order to encourage and provide a little bit of fertilization for your plants. And the plants, the bees actually do like this. It could be like our metallic sweat bees. Some of these species do nest on the ground. And on the image there, where there's a hand, there's like a nest that was accidentally dug up from digging in the garden. But they could also just nest by if there's enough like pile up of mulch there, they can actually nest right underneath that towards the surface. So yeah, this is an example of one of those what these bees look like. But maybe we don't have a property that looks that good. Sometimes we have, maybe there is more a patchy lawn, or maybe there's lawn with more, sand composition. Don't worry, we still are, there are some bee species that actually really like this type of lawn. And here is a species called Andrena asteris, and this is the aster mining bee, and she really likes sandy soils. And what's also really interesting about this bee species is that she is a specialist. So what I mean by specialist is that she only likes to collect pollen from a certain species, group of plants, and these are the asters. Asters, there are some asters that are blooming, throughout the summer, but this species usually comes out towards the end of summer and the fall, and she really likes those, late blooming species. Could be like a New England asters or some of these smaller yellow asters there. And these are just examples of what her nest look like, where she's digging underground. You can see that the back legs here, they have accumulated a ton of pollen from the asters that she's visiting. Our next group are going to be our stem and tree nesters. Okay, so they do have their tunnels, similar to what the ground nesters do, but these are, they're just working with one like reed, shaped structure most of the times. Just crudely here on my little drawing that I did on PowerPoint, you get to see there's like, a solitary bee. She has, gone through a tunnel either in a log or a stem, and she goes as deep as she can, and she brings all the pollen that she has, collected, makes it into a ball, and then lays her egg on top of it. And then she makes a wall, collects another ball of pollen, lays an egg, makes another wall, and so on and so on and so on. And at the first one, now you see that she just started a smaller ball that she will then seal off and be done. Some of these bees, they're not necessarily making their own holes. On the log on the bottom left, those could be holes that were made by boring beetles. So I have pines in my yard, and you got little pine boring beetles are making deep holes. They're opportunistic. They'll actually take advantage of those holes that are there, and if they're empty, she will start nesting in those too. Okay, and then at the bottom, you got my diagram. You have the pollen provision. Some folks also call it as bee bread. It's just a pollen ball that's been accumulated from a variety of different species of pollen, depending if she's a specialist or a generalist, and then the little egg that she lays on top. Okay, and then we have ones that use like stem nesters here, like those little serotina. We'll take a peek at what that looks like too. Okay, so I don't know how your property looks like, but here's a picture of my yard. This is my yard after the big storm yesterday. After it took me like about an hour to get home. Just from observation, and what we've been talking about previously. Is there anything you see on the picture of my yard? A little messy, but is there anything that you may see that you could point out that could potentially be bee habitat? You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. just pop open the chat. Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Hillary. Yeah, leaf litter. As the bumblebees are going to be happy with that, and other bees will be happy with this little leaf litter that's there too. Yep. What else? What else is there? Yep. Yeah, branches too. So I know this image after I took it, it's not the most accurate, but there's like, we have a wood pile there too. We have there is some sparse turf too. It's unfortunately my yard is mostly clay. But I keep looking at areas that have been eroded and the soil has gotten a little soft. So I keep getting hopeful that some bees will there. Yes, I do have some bare ground. Um, Not in the picture. I have some raised garden beds, and I have gotten some of those sweat bees nesting in there too. At least that soil is actually loose, and they can actually grow on there. But yeah, so um, yeah, so most of my yard, it doesn't look pretty, but there's a lot of wood and branches. There's leaf litter, and um, yes, old wood that can have holes too. So yeah, so towards the left there. So excellent answers, everybody. So the old wood is going to be the wood that the bees that are born into them are going to want to use. Now, right in the middle, that's a tree that was standing yesterday morning, but when I got home, it was snapped in half. It's going to take the bees are not going to use that tree that fell just yet. It's gonna once it starts, breaking down, decomposing, which can take a long time, is when they will actually start using it. It could be suitable for bee habitat. So they really take advantage of these, really, really old logs. So trying to make, the bright side of the storm. Yes, if you guys are safe, didn't have any damage, but any big logs or anything like that, you can incorporate that into your landscaping on your property. Maybe try to make them attractive. Maybe put some native plants around them, anything like that. But those old logs that they may have fallen from trees that were already dying or anything like that, you can place those strategically around your property, and those can become, native bee homes as well. Okay. Um, there are some folks that sometimes have a log and they can try to use a drill bit and make those holes for them. um, the bees really really like when the holes are really really deep. So once you got a really long drill bit, usually just letting the insects do the work, because they'll just continuously munch and munch on those logs and make the holes deep. So thank you all for participating. That was great. Okay, let me I can continue this. Okay, so the bees that are using those logs, they really like those logs and stuff. Are, the wood is kind of pulpy, a couple of pulpy material. If you see ones, especially around like, down in the woods, if you can break it up with your hands, they really like that kind of material. And some of them, if they're not nesting all the straight down and making walls, maybe they'll just nest and do little offshoots. Um, and this is a video from a log that I found at Beechwood Farms. I apologize if it's kind of laggy or anything like that, but we're going to be looking for metallic sweat bees that are flying around there. So I try to zoom in. I try to move my camera and pan with them, but they actually moved incredibly fast. So you can actually, you know, see the bee, enter that little hole. So these are all behaviors and things you would see at this very moment around this time. So these videos are from a couple of years ago, but it was during this time of spring that it was happening. And it doesn't have to be, maybe you have a wood pile, like, oh, you cut some logs for your fire. If you're not using that, they will eventually nest in there too. Okay. So we have ones that would nest in trees or that down old logs. Then there, the groups that actually use stems, tree stems. So one particular group is called these are called the small carpenter bees. They're actually called Ceratina. They're related. They're in the same family as the large carpenter bees, but they instead of boring into your decks or your porches or the sidings of your house, these little bees are utilizing the old stalks from some of the plants that you know finished flowering last year. They died, they dried, and they're still up. If those plants are still nice and woody and kind of hard, I got a question in the chat. Let me see that. Let's see. Let's see. Patricia Milliken. I have stick piles, lots of leaf litter, but last summer a species I think Mason chose to hollow plastic shades on my porch and began sealing eggs. Yes. That we have a mason bee is they're called Osmia cornifrons. I would suspect as those because those are the ones that are they are an established species that was used for apple pollination, but they will nest in plastic. They will nest in wind chimes. Maybe there's a hole in a I have a hole in a metal chair on my porch, and they started nesting in there as well. They they don't seem to be very particular. And even one day I was using a ladder, and the ladder had a hole on the side, and it was trying to check it out if it was a potential nesting site. So they're very bold, and will utilize anything like. Um, yes, that does happen. Thank you for sharing. Um, so these small carpenter bees will use like the old stems, and the photo on the right, you can see how again those eggs and the pollen that are collected are kind of provisioned in those walls. And what's really neat is that even though there's a little bee, it's just like munching away and that stick and making that tunnel really deep. All the pulpy material that she's like digging out, she actually reuses it to seal those walls. So she's not wasting any material when she's making these nests in those reeds there. Okay, so here's a site with a lot of dried sticks. This is from Beechwood Farms. This was a stand with a ton of there are plants like Joe Pyeweed and some goldenrods. It's not being kept; it's just being left alone. But you see the ones that fell. But if you want to manage this, if you want to be more intentional with the plants on your property, some of the plants that dry well for these are kind of our cone flowers. And there's a diagram on the left-hand side that kind of shows you how it's utilized, throughout the year. So in the spring, you can cut back all the dead flowers and let those drop. And the bees, will start utilizing these to lay their eggs, and then they will still be remaining there. So after they lay their eggs, those eggs are going to take about a year to emerge, and then once next spring goes, you cut them back again, and that will help any of the bees that are developing, and they're kind of like release. If you don't do that, they'll figure it out themselves. They can always they'll have mandibles to chew through them, but if you want to manage it to make it look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing and not let it be too tall, you can cut some of those heads and allow these don't completely remove them. So because if you remove the whole stalks, then you probably are moving solitary bees that are developing in these stems. So if you just cut off the heads and let those drop to the ground, then you can still help all these bees that are nesting on your property. But if you choose just to let it go and do its own thing, that is also fine. So again, this is just a patch that we have at Beechwood Farms as part of one of the trails. Nobody's managing that. That's just allowing it to stand as it is and keep it natural. And the bees are benefiting from it, and so are the birds. Okay, so let's talk about floral resources. So bees have to eat. Okay, so let's talk about how they travel and how far they travel. Let's think about like maybe your home is the middle of that plot here on this diagram. So most bees, especially the solitary ones, they're not really going far. They're going to be flying 250 meters to about a kilometer, and that 250 meters, that's around like 0.15 miles. And, so it's not a long distance that they're at. And a kilometer is barely a quarter of a mile. So they're traveling, they have a really short, you know, radius that they are traveling. So it's important that they have food in those regions, and they need to be traveling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to the nest. Um, um, yeah, and there is a positive relationship between the number of bee species and the percent of natural area. So if you live in a predominantly wooded area, not in the suburbs or anything like that, there's higher chances that you're going to have greater bee diversity on your property, especially if you're putting in some native plants as part of your landscaping. And here's just a graph, just kind of like to show the proof how this, like, so the proportion of forest area, there's a positive relationship with the wild bee species that are being collected. And this is just usually from studies that observed supplemental pollination to apple orchards. Okay, so how are bees collecting pollen? So there's different ways that they can collect pollen. So our social species, like the bumblebees on the left, and even the honeybees, they have pollen baskets or curbicula. So they're mixing the pollen with their nectar and saliva, and they're packing it into these grooves on their hind legs to be able to carry it to their hives. Um, all other species have hairs called scopa. So the scopa are the hairs that the pollen just sticks to their body, a little with a staggered tracy, but it could be on their abdomen, it could be on their front legs or their back legs, just wherever it could stick. And different species have scopa in different regions. And if you remember the aster mining bee, those back legs had her scopa. She had that pollen, holding that pollen in its dust form or its granule form, versus the bumblebees who have it in a more of a bee bread or pollen ball form. Is wet. Wet versus dry. There you go for these two. So Carbicula is wet, Scopa is pollen that's dry. And then there's bees like these Hylaeus bees or these masked bees that don't collect pollen on their body at all. They actually ingest the pollen and they keep them in their crop. It's just a expanded part of their digestive system. And then when they get back to their nest, which they nest in sticks as well, they just regurgitate it in there, and that's how they carry pollen. So there's no pollen baskets, no scopa or anything. And and you can see that these bees resemble wasps a little bit. And just because wasps, um, they are the carnivorous cousins to bees. They evolved first before bees and plants started having their relationship. So if you want, pollinators to have a good amount of food throughout the season on your property, you need to get a diverse set of flowering plants. They're going to be blooming across the entire season. So you got to think about what is blooming in the spring, what is blooming in the summer, and what's blooming in the late summer into the fall. There are going to be different species. They're going to be active at different times. And so we're going to just, there's, hundreds of different types of plant species as options, but I'm just going to, show a few of those plant species that could be useful, to plant in your garden and that you can find, available. Okay, so spring flowering plants that could be good. You have things like wild geranium. You actually see these growing around in the forests, but excuse me, you can actually you can buy them. Not just little plants, but you can think about trees. You have American serviceberry. And there's others, you have red buds are in bloom, things like that. Wild strawberries, wild columbines, Dutchman's breeches. If you walk through the forest as well, Dutchman breeches and violets are all in bloom right now. And bumblebees and other solitary bees, they really like these these deep plants they can actually dig themselves into and access. Especially these bigger bees that can actually get robust enough and actually push their way into these flowers. Um, Summer flowering plants, we can think about bee balms like Monarda fistulosa or Monarda didyma, which is like the bright red one. Beard tongue um, has, somewhat deep corolla where the nectar can be accessed and it has a lot of pollen. You have Culver's root, has these big inflorescences. The bees can actually, walk through and collect pollen varieties. These gel pie weeds are great because they have flat tops and actually act as really good landing pads for bees too. Um, White turtle heads, again, I think those are going to be popular with larger and stronger bees like bumblebees, where they can actually pry open the flower and actually enter. And then you got butterfly weed. Um, Butterfly weed is, it's going to be good for a variety of bee species, but if you want to encourage, you know, some butterflies, for a lot of these, butterflies are going to be super excited about these types of plants. Um, the only thing I caution about butterfly weed is that they have like other milkweeds that have a pollinia, and that's just the pollen is available in a really sticky ball that they stick to the insect, and sometimes bees get stuck with it because they get stuck on their foot and they actually die on the flower. You look at a lot of milkweeds, sometimes there's going to be a couple bees that could not leave the flower because the pollinia trapped them um, on there too. Um, yeah, and then we go into the summer and the fall. Brown eyed Susans, lobelias. They'll be flowering for a very long time. New England asters, I see them a lot along the roads and blooming late into the fall. Um, there's a lot of solitary bee species there, but a lot of like the bumblebees and both the new bumblebee queens and the males, they're going to be mostly active during the summer, late summer, and early fall. And while the males are not collecting pollen, they're drinking a lot of nectar, and these flowers are going to be providing it as well. So you have blazing stars, goldenrods, and some New York ironweed. Yeah, so having plants that are going to be blooming continuously, different species blooming continuously throughout the entire season. Um, it's going to allow them to, you know, in periods where there's, you know, potentially a dearth of food in other areas. And if you don't have any of these type of plant species, other plants that you have on your garden, like even on your turf, like goldenrod, clovers, those are all okay as well. Goldenrod, and I mean, not sorry, not goldenrod, dandelions are not native, they're very, very common. And when there's periods where there isn't any food for bees, dandelion is still a suitable candidate to get the bees going to, you know, throughout their day. Okay, so they when you're planning um, your your garden, there's just some basic requirements. Okay, so you need the food for the plants. You want um, diverse flower-rich foraging areas. Um, Allow them to, find areas with nesting sites where they can lay their eggs. Hollow stems, maybe muddy areas, maybe loose soil if you have it on your property. Places that are sheltered, the leaf litter for overwintering. And then there's a pesticide-free environment. Limit your use of pesticides. There are pesticides that could be systemic. That means that they can travel through different tissues of a plant. So they might be present on the leaves. If there's an insect eating the leaves, well, they get impacted by that pesticide. But it can also enter the nectar and the pollen and the petals of the flowers, even the root system. So having always looking at what you're using as a pesticide and make sure that you're using it to the directions on the label is also really, really important, just to limit unintended uh, impacts to our native organisms, whether they're bees or birds or other insects as well. When you're doing this, you don't have to do your whole property. You can actually just start small. So starting small with just a diverse group, and here's just a diagram. If you ever have looked or maybe are part of the certified backyard habitat, this is the diagram that's there. It gives you an idea of what a layout could be for doing a native planting. It doesn't have to be big, just have a variety of different species. You can have trees, you can have a variety of plants. You're helping native pollinator species, and obviously we're Audubon. We care about the birds as well. They can even be, you can do a container garden. It could be a planter on your property. Just bees will eventually, when you start putting out native plants and good floral resources, the bees will come and other pollinators will start. It's a slow process as things get more established, but once these insects find it, then hopefully they'll start finding it future years as well. I have when I purchased my house 4 years ago, the owner, landscaped everything on our property, and my wife and I have just been letting it go wild, and I've been seeing more and more different kinds of bee species, more and more different butterfly species, and also some more native plants. I have bloodroots and violets and May apples growing in my yard. One things that I did not see the first year I lived in this house, but have been slowly coming back. But I guess I've also planted some native plants like lobelias and pumpkins and things here too. Okay, so I will do a shameless plug of the Certified Backyard Habitat Program. So if I don't specialize much on doing suggestions on how to manage your property, but the folks who work with Certified Backyard Habitat can give you tips and ideas on how to enhance your property for pollinators and birds. And if this is something you're interested in, the person you want to contact would be Nick Stallman. He's our wild habitat educator, but he's also the person who's in charge of the Certified Backyard Habitat process. So his contact is there. He can, jot it down, or if you want it later, I can always email it to you. But he is the person to get in touch with. If you're interested in purchasing other plants, there are other, garden centers around Western PA. We have one on our property, and we carry, maybe over 150 native plants to Pennsylvania. Our native plant center coordinator is Roxanne Swan, and she definitely would be the person that can give you the tips and on how to, landscape your property. She has plans and, just ideas of what would work for diverse property types, whether you're really shaded, have a lot of sun, or have a mix of all those things. She is the person that can give you all that information on what to work with. And lastly, there's resources. So if you get really, really excited about IDing bees and seeing the bees on your property, just figuring out what everything is, there is a plethora of things. I mean, even our cell phones can just, take an image, use Google search or the equivalent of what that is for Apple phones, and it can give you like an idea of what those insects are. But if you're looking online, bugguide.com has a group of experts there IDing insects on the daily. Discover Life. Bumblebee Watch is one specifically for bumblebees. And there's an excellent book right here in the middle that actually has all the bumblebees for the entire North America. But there's also a PDF that you can download from the Forest Service, and it's free. So you can download the PDF for the free or buy the book, and it costs around $20. Xerxes Society if you're interested in anything about invertebrates, they are the group that specializes in that. And then I think the authority um, and how to plan your property to enhance it for native pollinators would be Heather Holm. She has a wealth of knowledge, and her website has a ton of resources, especially like fact sheets. So I've just dropped her website here. Here's just a screenshot what her website looks like, and yeah, I encourage you to check her website out. She has also published some of the books. So the bees one here on the top right, and that's one that we carry in the store, and she has published and has some really nice information about a variety of bee species you may find in your garden, their plant preferences, whether they're specialists or generalists, and what their life cycles are. Okay, and with that, I'd like to now leave it open for questions. You can either unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. I'm happy to answer anything you have.